Hello everyone, my name is Jenny Dodd and it's great to be with you this afternoon for TAFETalks, which is our last day of winter. And if you live in Canberra like I do, or if you live in other parts of Australia that are cold, it's always terrific when you start to see the blossom and we start to see the end of winter coming. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the First Peoples of all the lands we are all meeting on today. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land, which is Canberra. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend those respects to emerging leaders and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Welcome everyone, and a big welcome to Sandra Milligan, Megan Lilly and Jane Truen as our three speakers today. Our topic for today is general capabilities, employability skills, probably a bit around foundation skills, the whole area of general capabilities and what that means. There's been, for as long as I've been around in this sector, which is a long time, we've been talking about lifelong learning. But I think there is a particular renewed approach to lifelong learning as we move into this era of full employment, as we move into an era where the importance of uplifting existing workers' skills starts to dominate our conversations. So today we're going to focus a bit on general capabilities, a topic that for many of us has been of great interest. I'd like to begin by welcoming and introducing our first speaker, Sandra Milligan. Sandra is Professor Sandra Milligan is a director of the Assessment Research Centre at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, which is located in the University of Melbourne. Sandra has an unusually wide engagement with the education industry and in educational research. Originally, Sandra was a teacher of science and maths, and she is also a former director of curriculum in the Australian State Education Department, and has held senior research, management and governance positions in a range of educational organisations, including for government agencies, not-for-profit, small startup businesses and large listed international corporations. Sandra's current research interests have focused on assessment recognition and warranting of hard-to-assess learning. But she's here with us today for some of the specific work that she's done around general capability frameworks and assessment approaches that align to general capability frameworks. In inviting Sandra today, she was quite upfront in saying to me that she knows a lot about the school sector, a lot about the university sector, perhaps less about the vocational sector. So we're really looking forward to hearing those insights today, Sandra, in terms of how the work you've been doing around general capabilities and how it informs vocational education and training. After Sandra has presented, we will be hearing from Megan Lilly. And Megan Lilly is known to many of you around the traps in vocational education and training. Megan is Executive Director of the Centre for Education and Training at the Australian Industry Group. She's had an enduring commitment to research, policy and advocacy in education and training. And over her 30-year career, Megan has been consistent in the belief of the capacity of education and training to transform lives. Megan is currently a member of the Australian Industry Skills Committee, a board member of the National Apprenticeship Employment Network, Deputy Chair of World Skills Australia, member of the Australian College of Educators and the Australian Pacific Training Coalition. And Megan was also, and this is important, I think, in the context of this conversation today as well, on the AQF review panel, which some of you have been engaged with what's happening through that AQF review as the work is being progressed against a range of those recommendations through quite a series of consultations. After Megan has spoken, we'll hear, as we always do, from one of our TAFEs about how they're applying some of what we're hearing today. And we'll hear from Jane Truen. Jane is Executive Director, Educational Delivery at Box Hill Institute. Jane is a highly experienced senior vocational and higher education executive with a successful track record of developing innovative educational delivery strategies and successfully managing business reform. Jane's going to really focus on how general capabilities might be applied through our training package construct. So I'm going to invite Sandra to start in a minute, but if you've got questions, we invite you to use the Q&A Q&A is better than the chat because our panelists can access the Q&A and they can be putting in answers when they're not speaking. But if you do end up putting a question in the chat, that's okay too, but our preference would be to use the Q&A. So enough from me. I'd like to now introduce Sandra Milligan to lead us through a conversation around general capabilities. Thank you, Sandra, for being with us today.
Thanks, Jenny. My pleasure. Let me just share and then I can concentrate on what I'm saying instead of the technology. Is that showing? Brilliant. Okay, so Jenny, yes, last day of winter. I'm coming to you from the Wadjuk community of the Noongar Nation, which is in Perth. And for those of you in Perth will know that the wattle is all over the place. It's just brilliant. So spring has sprung here. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present from these lands. Today, I'm going to talk about general capabilities. I am not going to prosecute the case for including them in the curriculum. There has, since the Maya competency report, I'm sure there are many people in the audience who don't remember that, not that old. Since those times, there have been 2 or 3 reports every year that says that educators from early childhood through to continuing education and through primary, secondary and tertiary have said that it's important that we focus on these general capabilities. And in fact, they've been included, as we know, in most curricula and so forth for at least a decade. So I'm not going to prosecute the case for why. What I want to talk about is the practicalities of how. And I'm assuming that in the audience today, there are people who have leadership positions. And I want to talk to you about the experience of the leaders that we've worked with over the last probably decade, but mostly in the last 5 or 6 years. The Assessment Research Centre, of which I'm a director, is what's called an enterprise unit, and that's code for we have to make our own living, which means that we work with industry partners who have a problem to solve, and we help them, work with them in an R&D capacity to help them solve it. And I'd say that over the last 5 or 6 years, the vast majority of our work is people coming to us and saying, we want to teach these general capabilities. We've got the learning ambition. We've thought it through in terms of how we teach, but we're bumping up against the assessment side of it. We know that there needs to be alignment of learning ambition, learning design, assessment design, and credential design. How do you do this? This is too hard. So that's been our main work. Everything I tell you today has come from our experience with leaders in a practical sense, trying to do the right thing by their learners and their stakeholders. As Jenny said, we've done, my team, 20 or 30 people, have done most of our work in schools, even early childhood, quite a bit in university, some for professional associations, so in the professions, and a little bit in vet. So I do not come to you as an expert in vet, but I do believe that there are some common learnings across the education system, and that's what I want to share with you today. I'm going to go fairly quickly so that you can stop and ask questions, or I'll distribute my PowerPoint if there are things that you want to go through a bit later. But first of all, let me just tell you what is a general capability, I think, and what is not. And I think this is a key point. When I talk about general capabilities or 21st century skills or employability skills or general foundational skills, I'm talking about a particular set. And I think it's important to know not only what they are as the objects of teaching, but also what they are not. And this is what I just want to spend 1 minute on. First of all, what we're talking about is attitudes, values, beliefs, skills, and knowledge that will transfer from one context to another. So if you learn to be a plumber, you learn lots of things about plumbing that applies only to plumbing. If you want to change careers and change into being a child care worker, what can you take with you? The answer to that question is the general capabilities. They also have to be learnable, so they're not inherent dispositions, teachable and accessible. If they're not all of those things, then they shouldn't be in the curriculum or called general capabilities. That's pretty, I know that's pretty glib, but it's really important to understand. I know there's a lot of discussion about whether general capabilities are transferable and general. And typically people talk about problem-solving skills when they have that question. They say, how can you solve a plumbing problem if you know nothing about plumbing? How can you solve a medical problem if you know nothing about medicine? The answer, of course, is, well, you probably can't. But if you come up against a problem which you have never, ever met before, you will bring a series of dispositions and skills and attitudes to that problem that will carry you through. So, for instance, things like thinking about the problem and not just diving in, knowing that there will be experts around that you can ask, figuring out that maybe it'll be easier to solve if you collaborate with others. So it's those general skills, dispositions, and attitudes that you can learn in one environment that you can take to the next. And of course, the reason why people advocate for these is because of the flexibility that people need to flip through from career to career and job to job. I think that's why employers are so keen. So that's the sort of, people often ask, but surely problem solving is not generic. And I say, no, not all problem solving is, but there are big components of skill that are generic and transferable. And this is what we're worrying about. So that's the sort of skills we're talking about. Oops. Why aren't, now, these are not new in any sector, schools, vet or tertiary education, and you're all familiar with these skills that have been around for some time. One of the reasons why people are looking to develop newer frameworks than these is not that there's anything wrong with these, but the general capabilities that are currently thought to underpin the transfer of skills and the capacity to move from place to place are more extensive and different in many ways to these kinds of skills. They include the ASQA kind of foundation skills or the core skills for work or whatever in employability skills, but they go beyond. And some of the ways they go beyond, I'll just quickly mention a couple, and we can explore this in more detail if you want. But for instance, if you look at, this is a drafty kind of framework that was set up in one of the DESI consultancies about what a framework might be for the tertiary sector. And what you'll see in it is that there's quite a lot of overlap with the ASQA framework, unsurprisingly, but it's got other things in it. For instance, it's got things like critical thinking. It's got things like active citizenship. And that's not just in the community, it's in the company or the workplace as well. It's got ethics and integrity. It's got intercultural capability. It's got taking responsibility for actually being responsible for your own learning. Now, these are deeper competencies. They can go further and they're more extensive than the sort of lists that are in, say, the Australian school curriculum or the ASQA foundation skills and so forth. So people are saying, let's I think what they're saying, I mean, this is what I hear people that work with us say, we want to have a look at the whole person and what they need to know to thrive in their workplace, in their personal life, and their community. So it goes beyond foundational basic skills. In fact, this little pentagon, or no, pentagon made up of hexagons, I think, to be precise. So they have it, the core capacity to thrive. And that's what the general capabilities are aimed at. Oh, so is all of schooling and education, let's face it. But we focus a lot on, traditionally, on the know-how and the knowledge and the basic literacies. But we sometimes forget these broader things like learner agency, like capacity to connect to communities of interest that will sustain you through your life and career, like broader skills, like communication is much more than basic literacies. It's being able to have empathy and communicate and persuade and all of those things. So this sort of pentagon, this pentagon is a stylistic representation of what people are wanting their learners to have. And it's the assessment and teaching of this component of it that people come to us about. Anyway, I've rattled on for long enough about what a general capability is and how they're looking. I just want to now turn very quickly to the nuts and bolts of how our leaders, educational leaders with whom we're working, how they are regarding these general capabilities, not as rhetorical flourishes as they are on this slide, everyone needs to do it, but as objects of professional teaching, learning, and assessment. So this is different. So they want to dig underneath and say, well, okay, if you want to teach citizenship, how do I view citizenship if I'm the teacher and the assessor and the course designer? Now, the first thing to know, or the first thing that seems to work for people, is that they think about the construct or the capability, say citizenship, and they recognise that we're not trying to get people on a scale of 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 100 on citizenship. We're just trying to place them on levels of citizenship that relate to the granularity that employers or your normal person wants to know. So this is, those of you who have got sort of academic backgrounds or have done your theory, this is based on the Dreyfus theory of development of expertise or competence in any field, and it applies to general capabilities. So really you're just wanting assessment or thinking about the development of people is just really understanding what the pattern of behaviours are at sort of several qualitative shifts in level. If I can just sort of give you an example, here's a developmental progression for citizenship. So if someone's looking to discriminate between some applicants, say, on citizenship, what might they look for? So this describes the behavioural characterisation of people who are at different levels of citizenship. I've chosen citizenship because I figure not very many experts in citizenship in the audience, but I might be wrong. So I'm very happy to stand corrected on any of the detail. But, citizenship exhibits itself in different ways from people. So at a base level, you've probably got someone who just does what everyone does and they do as they're told and they sort of stick by the rules and they don't step out very far. A couple of rungs about that, you might get the reflective citizen who sort of thinks, oh, is this right? Is this how we should be organising ourselves? Maybe down at the pub, they have arguments about whether this policy or that policy is right. And then at the top, you get the person who's actively trying to improve the society. So do you see what I mean by those big lumps, but big leaps? You're not trying to get people on a scale of 0 to 100 on citizenship. You're just trying to find out how you can characterize them in a developmental progression of performance on citizenship. And this is the basis of the teaching, the learning, and the assessment. Because if students know what the leaps are, teachers know what they are, assessors know what they are, and know what the behavioural indicators are at each level, teaching becomes possible, learning becomes possible, and assessment becomes possible, and so does reporting. In our experience, we've found that you can chart the progression, that this is meant to represent someone in kindy, and this is someone up there at the top of their professional skill, and teachers can work within these bands of the progressions, and it's quite straightforward to characterize what that development looks like as you go through life. I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to keep rattling. I hope I'm not talking too fast. This is an example of a credential that is based on this kind of thinking about general capabilities. So this is a small school system in the secondary sector, but they're in upper secondary, but they have a lot of VET, a lot of work, embedded learning, and it's not at all like a senior secondary school normally is. And this is the credential that is now used as an alternative to the HSC or Cert 1, 2, 3 or whatever that students can get. And the capabilities they've looked at are things like communication skills, quantitative reasoning, empirical reasoning, things like that. And these petals show, and all these concentric circles are the levels of the progression I told you about. And this is where this student is up to. So with this yellow one, I can't read my yellow screen. I think that might be empirical reasoning, I'm not sure. But this Abby has got up to this level here, level 4 in empirical reasoning, but she's really powered through on knowing how to learn. So this is a way you can represent this. And of course, there's no pass or fail. You're just up to where you're up to, and you know what you need to do next. It's a way of giving a holistic view of what students can and can do. It can be strengths-based, so you don't have to put down here if you're not good at spelling, but you can show your strengths. Employers like it, and tertiary institutions are using this now. It's a digital artifact, so you can flick through to specific examples of Abby's portfolio to see what it means. So this is the idea of assessment, teaching and learning of general capabilities is that you're going to the competence that students are developing in generalizable, transferable skills and representing them in a standard way, but not standardized, standard way that is useful for employers. It's really useful for the learner, and off you go. Anyway, I hope that tantalizes you a bit, but just we've used these sorts of profiles in all sorts of credentialing environments. We've done that one you saw was big picture. We've done one in the Philippines department for students who are out of school because they have to work on the employability skills. We did an employability credential for the Latrobe Valley Authority. So a number of organisations are now using this approach to credentialing as well as assessment. So it's pretty interesting. I won't go into this, but obviously, you cannot assess these things using standardised performance tasks or examinations or objective tests or whatever. You actually need an assessment design that gives you the robustness that you need if you want to report to external stakeholders. And I'll just flip over that. If you want to have a look at some of the features of the assessment design that we build in to make sure they're robust, I've just put some there. Obviously, being the nerd that I am, I could go into this sort of slide for about 3 hours if you gave me the opportunity, but I'll resist it right now. I wanted to make 2 other points only. First, in our experience, this sort of thing works for learners and their stakeholders if the organisation that's issuing the report, and that's typically at school or college or network of schools or college level, if they do it properly, and that takes time, usually at least 2 to 3 years, if you know what your capabilities, what your learning ambitions are for your students. It really does, it's a process of change in the organisation. It's not something that can turn on a sixpence. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes support from jurisdiction authorities, preferably, although at the moment there isn't that much support for this sort of thing from jurisdiction authorities. And to me, it depends entirely on leadership at the institutional level and at the jurisdiction level. And these are the sorts of things that we'd be encouraging the leadership to do if people want our learners to come out the other end with the degree of general capabilities to match their domain-specific ones that will enable them to thrive when the world changes and the knowledge changes and their jobs change and all of those sorts of things. So, Jenny, I'm going to stop there and hope that I've sort of offended enough people that they'll ask questions. How's that?
I certainly don't think you've offended anyone, Sandra, and I think what you've done is shown some really rich insight into the possibilities, in a way, that exist. And I think there will be some questions emerge as we go along. But before we get to questions, we're going to turn to Megan, because I think, Megan, what we've asked you to talk or reflect on a bit today is what's industry and employer response to what's happening in this field of general capabilities. Where do you think this may go? So over to you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to just sort of talk about it more in the broad, first of all, because on the one hand, it's perfectly fine to position employers as responding to what's happening. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that employers have variably been asking for stuff like this for quite some period of time. So it's not one or the other. In fact, like yourself, Jenny, I've been around the system for about 30 years, but who's counting? And I can't remember a time when we haven't had this discussion, but we might have been using different labels. And we might have been talking about, you know, where we do it. Are they teachable? Are they accessible? Sorry, you know what I'm trying to say, and all those sorts of things. So many elements of the conversation haven't changed. And in fact, if I think back, you know, I think Sandra mentioned the Mayor Key competencies. I remember doing one of my very first projects on the Mayor Key competencies. But one thing you learn is there's lots of versions of them, but if you look internationally, there's also lots of versions of them. So there's no definitive perfect version. So, you know, and they've all got some cultural derivation and all that sort of stuff. But I think the point is that everybody's having the same conversation because they're important and they're valued. And I thought the point that Sandra ended up on about the graduate being able to thrive in effect in a modern economy where things move, shift, change. And I think that that's absolutely the compelling reason now. But it isn't just about the economy or work. It's actually about functioning more broadly in a really complex society. And we do live in a complex world. And I think the boundaries between work and community continue to blur. So I think we do need general capabilities for life, frankly, and for lifelong learning. And if you look at lifelong learning, you can look at it over the person's working life, and whichever stage they may be in, or whatever combination of things are happening in their working life, the general capabilities will be part of that equation. And I think we implicitly understand that, but we're perhaps not quite so good at articulating it, because it can get complicated. And it does sound complicated when you start talking about domains and all these sorts of things. People feel like they need to get the roadmap out. And I often think, in a way, it's better to actually just think about, for people to embrace the top level of it and let other people do the hard work. Always a good idea. No, but I think we need that. That's really a comment about valuing the language of it and actually building the language of the general capabilities into all of our sort of approaches to training, but approaches beyond training as well. So I just wanted to make the point about the international and the history, and that this is not a new point, but this is a new development on that pathway. And Sandra did put up a beautiful schema of what they are, and every time I see that, I see agency and ethics sitting there together, and I don't know why, but I find it terrific that we've actually evolved to that form of conversation around general capabilities. And I'm just putting a bit of personal bias hat here, I suppose. But I do think we are entering into a world, both the world of work and the world of learning and just community at large, where people have to self-manage more. So a learner needs more agency, a citizen needs more agency, all these sorts of things. But agency is also an obligation, and that's where the ethics piece comes in. And so I want to stress that strongly, because I can look at certain parts of the world and see lots of agency without ethics, and we wouldn't want to be following that path. So I think our notion of general capabilities, foundation skills, whatever you want to talk, has broadened. And I think, digital skills is the other area that is considered a core foundational skill these days. And it absolutely is. And I think the pandemics which of course was after we handed in the AQF review, has just amplified that. So you don't sort of the conversation we used to have about should you add another one is a redundant conversation now, because digital literacy is just so important. So all of these things come together and combine. And I think one of the difficulties we've had in the vocational system over a long period of time, we were really good at talking about technical stuff, and we're really good at codifying it. And we've grappled with the other stuff more in terms of how we build the relationship between the two, or how they cooperate and coexist and in fact add to each other. And I think in the early days we used to sort of have technical plus add-on, and we've evolved past that sort of way of viewing these sorts of things. But I think we're still yet to evolve more fully into how we embrace them from a nomenclature point of view and cultural practice, but also sort of in the delivery environment, if you want to put it that way. So I do appreciate that I'm doing a little bit of rambling here, but I also think going forward that we do need, as a country, a lifelong learning strategy or framework. I'll call it perhaps a framework, because we love frameworks, don't we? And so that framework is not like the qualifications framework. It really is how you actually set up the system for people to continuously learn. I guess we're fundamentally talking about their working life, so it is about shorter form credentialing, but a lifelong learning framework would also hit other regulatory and funding and other things. So it has a different purpose. But the reason I say that is because in a lifelong learning framework, if we are to successfully keep people skilled, reskilled, upskilled, in fact, let their skills deepen, which is another thing we forget to talk about, that we do need a framework that embraces all the things we're talking about and enables flexibility and adaptability And as Sandra so beautifully puts, the capacity to thrive. I mean, why would anyone not want that? Whether we're talking about it in a learning environment or a working environment or just life at large. So learner agency and social agency, I think, are going to become increasingly more important, and they won't happen. Well, they could happen by happenstance, but I think that would be negligent for us to do that. We've been involved in this conversation and journey for a very long time now, and I think it's moving to a better place. There's work to be done. Back to the core of your question is how is industry responding? Industry is asking for all of this stuff. It always says, I want the rounded person. I mean, you know, we used to hear different versions of it. And workers need very flexible skills more and more these days. But that doesn't mean that the language of industry aligns with the language of the system. So there's work to be done there, and whether we sort of find those agreements. But and Sandra talked about it as being important these are my words, not Sandra's, but in terms of labour mobility, moving between jobs and stuff. I actually think they're important within jobs as your skills grow and evolve. And I think jobs don't stand still at all. And so you need all of these things kicking in as part of your daily life in being a functioning and hopefully thriving worker. So I think we've got a lot more work to do. I think we're doing a lot of really good work around the architecture of it. I think we've got a lot more work to do to continue to help it be more accessible in probably an explicit way to employers, and those schemas that Sandra held up are perfect examples of how that could happen. But I also think the vocational system's got a lot of work to do. I reckon I could find heaps of teachers that wouldn't have a clue what we're talking about. So, you know, we've all got to do this together. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Megan. And I think you reflect on what, you know, a changing, which has always been there to some extent, but maybe the momentum for change and the complexity of those changes is driving some of what needs to happen now. And I think one of the pieces of work that AIG and BCA and ACTU and ACCI have done in terms of the Jobs and Skills Summit over the next couple of days, you've been talking about a lifelong learning strategy, and maybe it is that sort of framework, or a lifelong learning framework, as you say, that is now something that might give some structure to this. Before we turn to Jane, though, Sandra, I want to ask you, and we will come to other questions after Jane, what's students' response to this? You showed us that example of Abby. And do you have any research on how do students respond when this is part, because this, as you said, it has to be accessible, when this is part of, and Abby now has this diagram that shows she's got, you know, she's progressed really strongly here, and perhaps there's a bit of room for movement somewhere else. What has been students, especially in schools, you know, upper secondary schools, what's been their response?
Well, let me pull out a couple of things. First of all, they say, I am not my ATAR. I am more than my grade. And this is a way of explaining who I am, what I can do, that I think, they say, that I think employers and tertiary institutions ought to know about me for when they're letting me in or picking me or whatever. So I think the going beyond the grade, going beyond pass fail, having a jagged profile so that people are understood as who they are. The students typically love that. Second, the students will not walk away from ATAR and HSC and VCE if that's the main way they get into university or the main way they get selected. So we've got a catch-22 here. They want that sort of thing, and they love it when they've got it, but they can't let go of the alternatives yet. And parents are in the same boat. Oh, you know, I don't want my student to go through that examination system as the only way that sets their standards. I'd love this, but if they don't focus on their examinations, they might not get into Monash Med, or they might miss out on an apprenticeship. So we're in this catch-22 that all the value propositions in our society are hooked on the old way of thinking. And that's why in the Assessment Research Centre, we spend all our time trying to work up the assessment and credentialing components of this so that the value proposition is more obvious to people, because people will go where you assess. Basically, that's the bottom line. That they will see that as the real curriculum. The other thing they say is, how come I get selected on a whole pile of things that have got nothing to do with this? So they're looking with baleful eye at the recruiters and selectors who depend on the traditional way. So it's sort of, so that's not a very crisp answer, but I think it's realistic that this is a systemic thing, and that I'm sincerely hoping that the policy directions we're moving in are getting to the point where these kinds of things are recognised, valued, and have utility for both sides of the equation, utility for the student and utility for the selector and recruiter. Because at the moment, it's not based on anything very transparent or even effective. So that was a long answer to a short question, but that's what I think.
Thanks, Sandra. Well, let's now turn to Jane, who's going to talk about the practical way in which Box Hill has embedded some of this thinking into the delivery of some of our training packages. Thank you, Jane.
Hey, thank you, Jenny. First of all, while my slides are coming up, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we're all meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We might start off on the next slide, thanks. So I just want to talk about how Box Hill Institute embed general capabilities and employability skills into our programs. I'm going to talk about 3 examples. What are very different, and how we're embedding these things within our programs, or at the beginning or at the end, or bolting on the side of. But these examples will show you how we're adding depth and richness to the student learning. So we might go to the next slide. So our first example I want to talk about is how Box Hill have gone in and we've gone into partnership with Jobs Victoria in an initiative for the hospitality and hairdressing sectors. This initiative started last year, and it was designed to help these 2 sectors that were very heavily hit throughout COVID. The program's aligned to Jobs Victoria job seekers, to an employer, and through education, and aligning with our industry partners as well. So why I wanted to use this as an example was the model that the program we designed had 3 parts to it. So the end game was for these students or job seekers to end up with a job, plus have a full accredited qualification. But we designed a program that actually incorporated a lot more to that. So we started off with a work readiness program, which was a 2-week intensive where students learned basic employability skills tailored to those 2 sectors. So we brought in a lot of the different things that have been mentioned by both Sandra and Megan, and we really trained up these students to, when they got assigned to an employer, they actually knew the basics of what was required going into that job role. So it was and it was a lot to do with, and I know there's been many names which has been mentioned by Megan as well about, soft skills, 21st century skills. And now, employability skills was definitely something that we wanted to make sure that this job readiness was setting a student up, that once they walked into that salon or a restaurant or a cafe, they knew what the basics were that they had to start with. After that 2-week intensive, we had an idea on what the student was like and what the type of employer would be best suited to them. So that's when we started to look at connecting the student with an employer, and then we commenced front-end training. So the front-end training could consist of things like skill sets. It could be more credential work, but we definitely worked in a lot of the core credentials like teamwork, critical thinking, problem solving, digital literacy, certainly a big one when we were working remote. And that could actually be commenced at the start, as I said, or throughout the qualification. Part of this initiative is that the students had to end with a qualified accredited program at the end, as well as being employed for 12 months by that employer. So at that point, we assigned the student to an employer. They actually got then assigned to a mentor, and that mentor worked with the student and the employer for the first 12 months to make sure that we were really setting them up for success. They helped them with the credentials, with the employability skills. They helped them with the accredited training. They helped them with the industry focus as well. So this initiative was so successful that, we'll go to the next slide. This year, we've been fortunate enough to be able to go back to Jobs Victoria and actually roll it out across the Institute to all of our faculty areas. So now we've developed different programs. There's 5 different qualifications we're doing in the trade area. So we've got automotive, electrotechnology, refrigeration, carpentry, plumbing. In our health faculty, we've got dental, individual support, aged care, operation theatre tech, mental health, disability, youth work, and in our IT faculty, we've got information technology and cybersecurity. So they're so diverse in the faculties. We had to really look at these programs and really customise this employability skills and the general capabilities that we were building in it, whether it was the front end or during. And they did differ between qualification, between industry sector, between employer, but it made such a great all-round experience for the students. So as well as completing their training package qualification, where we saw areas that may have been missing in the training package, we could introduce those, whether it's skills through some of the skill sets or soft skills credentials, but certainly looked at where all the gaps were and building that overall experience for that student. So, you know, things like the attrition certainly lifted student satisfaction, and really we looked at all these different approaches, and it's been it's exciting space, you know, and every one of those industry areas, they all have industry mentors that are aligned to each of these students. So the students have got that go-to person as well as their teacher, you know, as well as their employer. So they've got a lot of support that's helping them get through the program. So, you know, we were very fortunate that we got involved in this initiative, and it certainly led to the growth and expansion of some of these areas to take it to another level. I'll go to the next slide, thanks. So I want to talk about example 2 and about Learn Local. So a unique position to Box Hill Institute is being a TAFE, we're also a Learn Local organisation. So we're very, and that's based in at our Centre for Adult Education entity in the Melbourne CBD. So we are known as an adult education institute in that way. We do have programs through ACFE, so the Adult Community of Further Education, where we deliver and particularly focused on employability skills and other training of general capabilities like digital literacy is one of our biggest programs. And they're like pre-accredited training that we can really start helping different cohorts of people come into that space and sort of build up skills so then they can pathway into the training package qualifications. In those areas as well, we give them taste on the different industry sectors. So if they have a focus on fashion, we will get them to do some of the fashion skills and then pathway them into a fashion qualification or hospitality, or it could be all sorts of different programs. But these programs have definitely given our learners the confidence to pathway into the accredited programs or employment. And they've been a great area for certainly lifelong learners, but, you know, students, we have a lot of students with disabilities go through this pathway. We have a lot of people that have been out of training for a long time that don't have the confidence to go straight into a qualification. And this is giving them a taste, but actually getting these employability skills focused together. So once they come into the qual, they've got more confidence. We'll go to the next slide. So a second part of what we're doing, we set up, prior to the release of the Macmillan Review, we designed a micro-credential framework, like just about every RTO across Australia and the world. But it's certainly our program that we looked at, that we designed, which is the generic versions, is a stream of core credentials titled Business Essentials, Leadership Essentials, and Technology Essentials. So many of the business essentials, they certainly are programs where all of our training package qualifications, doesn't matter what industry sector they're from, we can introduce some of these types of streams and we can bolt them on. We can enhance programs and units of competency, and that, you know, where we need a bit more like problem solving or again, digital literacy, critical thinking, we can introduce these skills where it's required, alongside of the core credentials. So they're the generic credentials, but then we have a specialist credentials framework. So that's when we take an industry sector, and there might be an industry that's got a training package qualification, but it still might be missing some of the latest skills required that's new to the industry sector, or it mightn't be covered in the training package. So this is where we develop a specialist credential, and we can add that to the qualification and enhance the learning. So we're actually giving our students a value add, so to speak, and a point of difference. So we also, with the credentials, we've developed a suite of credentials for all our educators and teachers, and they go from mentors to all sorts of different, there was about 6 different developed throughout the program. And it's something that when they're going through their TAE training, they can do these credentials as well and get into things like universal design and all sorts of other things. And we also award them to awards and partner programs like products like Microsoft, where we develop co-branded credentials and things as well. So this is a little bit about what our pre-accredited or non-accredited, certainly employability skills, that was almost like a bolt-on or embedded in or alongside or up front or at the end. And it's every qualification, every industry sector. We looked at where was the most appropriate and brought it in at that right relevant time. So we'll go to the last example. So the last example is where we've had general capabilities embedded into programs utilising advanced technologies like augmented reality. And what we've done is, certainly throughout COVID, where we had to go remote overnight like everybody else, it gave us an opportunity to look at our programs that we were going to turn online. Some we came back on campus, some we kept parts of the program still remotely delivered or online. But also we looked at how we could introduce advanced technologies into some of our programs, and certainly to help the students better understand the concepts and the data easier. So one thing, one course that the picture shows our cross-laminated timber program, where that what we did originally when we set up that program before COVID it was just a normal program delivered on campus, but once we went remote, we couldn't actually get all the concepts developed. So we thought if we bring in augmented reality, we could look at, like, there's the shell, there's the windows, there's the roof. We could actually pinpoint, and students could go through learning each step by step, but not just building in the content relevant to the product, but building in these employability skills and then the soft skills and all of these different focuses on the general capabilities that we wanted to enhance. So there's tiny little reminders throughout that development, which is just reinforcing the learning to the students all the time. And certainly that's what we're finding is given that depth and richness to the student learning. It's not just covering the basics of what's in the training package. This is like, okay, how else can we expand it so it really reinforced to a student? So they're just 3 little examples of what we do at Box Hill Institute, but we have found it sort of certainly, and I know it was mentioned by Megan and Sandra about the digital literacy. That is something, you know, that's really starting to ramp up in a big way now. But being able to introduce these, you know, employability skills and give our students that extra point of difference. So when they go out to go for a job, they've got all these additional things on their CVs, as well as just the core, you know, accredited qualifications. So yeah, we're some of our areas are coming up with some amazing things at the moment, and it's exciting times. So, you know, I know COVID was very hard. Everybody had to go remote, but there's been such a lot of innovation and reinvention from our teaching areas, and it's an absolute pleasure to witness what they come up with at times. So I'll leave it at that. And I know.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jane. That's terrific. Jane, can I ask you to look at a few of the questions? There's a couple for you. One is from Ian around funding. Another is from Kevin. But I've got a question for you firstly. Who teaches some of this? Are they let's look at the trade group. Are they your trade teachers, or do you use other people to teach it? Just quickly, because we've got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, look, we have a mixture. We have a teaching and learning college. So a lot of some of these general capabilities that's generic gets delivered through that group. But sometimes the trade teachers, we have certainly every industry area has certain educators that get trained up into some of these areas. So I would love every teacher to do it, but we're going to be realistic. But we certainly have groups of people, and we're building the capability in our workforce and our teachers.
Thanks, Jane. If you look at the Q&A,
I'll have a look at the questions.
That would be great. And everybody can see Jane's answers if you click on the tab answers.
Okay.
I've got two questions that are coming from the Q&A. One is for you, Megan, which is a question from Narelle towards the end of the Q&A, which is around the Australian Core Skills Framework and the Core Skills for Work Development Framework. Where do you see it fitting in with the notion of general capability? So I'll ask you to think about that for a minute and then maybe provide an answer. And Sandra, for you, which I'll ask you to think about, the notion of transferability in the work that I was on the working committee that you were part of and Megan was part of, led out of the Department of Education. Some comments on transferability would be great, Sandra, and in a tick. We'll go firstly to Megan and then to you. There's a few questions on or comments on transferability slipping through the questions. Megan, over to you.
Yeah, great question, Narelle. And I think it is one of the things that people grapple with, that we live in a world of multiple frameworks. And it gets confusing, particularly if you are in whatever you do intersecting with them, you know, consciously or explicitly or whatnot. But if you actually look at the core skills framework and the core skills for work framework, they're actually very specific. They're more specific, whereas the general capabilities, the word general is the clue. So I guess in that sense, it sort of sits above it. And it is also designed to be across sectors as well. Now, that's going to be a lot of work in that ambition, but that is also part of its design feature. But I do think it's part of that, what I was talking about before about getting the language right earlier on. I think this is part of what we've got to work through to help people engage with these things rather than making it complicated. Yeah, and they must feel like that for some people. So good point.
Thanks, Megan. And I think we've given a bit of feedback to the department that we need some guidance that there's one framework for vocational education development of product, not these multiple ones for them.
That's right.
Yeah. So thank you, Megan. Sandra, there were a couple of, Lani, I think, had a comment about transferability. There were a couple of comments. We are going to run out of time, so I ask our other speakers to just glance through any of the questions, and if there's anything there they'd like to add comment on, that would be great. Any comments from you, Sandra, on transferability or some final words in our last 2 minutes?
Yeah, okay. So transferability is a big debate point. Some people don't believe that there is transferability, others do. What I would say is that most of the evidence base, say in the research literature, is based on premises that were made 20 years ago that no longer apply, and that we need to build an evidence base. The evidence base that I'm most familiar with is the materials that we're getting at the University of Melbourne based on assessments. And I think it's coming through that there are transferable skills, but everyone uses the same language and means different things. And this is why Megan's point and Jenny, your point about needing a common framework with a common language and perhaps common standards is really important. And I reiterate, that does not mean everyone doing the same thing. It means everyone having the same understanding underpinning it. And I think that will enable us to focus down on what is transferable and important and what's not, and to be having the same discussion with each other that we think we're having and not talking past each other. So, you know, that's a rapid fire response, trying to get it into 2 minutes. Sorry.
So thank you, Sandra. I think what your answer to that shows what a live conversation it is, and something that's very much there and part of what we're talking about. It's been great today to have you three talk about some core essence of education, which is, I think, really nice for us at times to put our attention on the learner, the student, education, and also then what industry are looking for and how this can inform that. So to Sandra, to Megan, to Jane, many thanks from TDA for taking the hour to be with us this afternoon. And to all our participants, thank you for joining us today. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.